Sir, step out onto the porch. Hands where I can see them.
My hands are visible. I'm staying in the threshold. Show the warrant on camera and confirm the address.
We'll talk out here. Step outside first, then we'll show you paperwork.
No. First, you explain to me what is going on.
Sir, give me your name and date of birth. Prove you live here.
Just after midnight, an ICE team boxed in the Pierce residence like they were sealing off a scene, not knocking on a door. Vehicles angled in tight. Bright lights flooded the yard and front porch. Agents in tactical vests took positions across the property line and driveway, watching the front door like they expected someone to run. Adrian Pierce stepped into the doorway and stayed there, hands visible, body still. No sudden movements. He didn't step into the yard and he didn't let them control the space. He kept the interaction on one condition. The team needed to present the warrant in a way that could be recorded, and they needed to confirm the address before anything moved forward. The lead agent, Travis Harlow, tried to turn that into a compliance problem. He pushed for Adrian to exit first. He treated the request for documentation as refusal to cooperate. He used authority, tone, and urgency to force a sequence where Adrian would be outside, exposed, and easier to manage. Julia Pierce moved into position behind Adrian and made the next part hard to rewrite later. She announced the doorbell camera and exterior cameras were recording and actively saving. She started documenting out loud who was present, how the vehicles were positioned, and the fact that the lead agent was refusing to present the warrant on camera. And before we go any further, we want to tell you this straight. We're genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and lets us keep telling stories where people hold the line and the record stays clean. Now drop where you're watching from in the comments, your state or your country. And if you like stories about staying calm, getting things on camera, and forcing officials to follow procedure, hit like and subscribe. Here's how it started, because this moment didn't come out of nowhere. The Pierces had been home, winding down, and the neighborhood was quiet. Then the alert hit. Julia checked the doorbell feed first and saw multiple vehicles pulling in fast and lights snapping on. She didn't open the door to see what was going on. She treated it like a situation that could turn into a report later. She verified that recordings were saving, then positioned herself where her voice would be captured clearly. Adrian approached the door with the same discipline. He didn't rush. He didn't shout questions through glass. He positioned himself at the threshold where the legal line is clear. He understood what that line means at night, with lights in your face and agents trying to control the rhythm. Harlow approached like the goal was speed. He tried to control the order. Step out, then talk. That order matters, because the moment a person exits, the space becomes the agent's environment. Lighting, angles, distance, and movement all start working against the homeowner. It also gives the team more room to claim they saw something or interpreted something a certain way. Adrian didn't give him that. He kept repeating that he needed the warrant presented on camera and the address verified. He didn't argue about politics. He didn't argue about the agency. He kept it narrow and legal, authority first, movement second. Harlow tried to reframe it. He described Adrian's position as non-compliance. He pushed the idea that Adrian was required to follow instructions first and ask questions later. He tried to make the request for paperwork sound like a stalling tactic. Julia made that harder by documenting every choice out loud. She requested names and badge numbers. She noted vehicle markings and plates when they were visible. She stated that the team was refusing to produce the warrant in a recordable way. She didn't insult anyone. She didn't escalate. She kept it factual and timestamped. That's when Harlow shifted tactics. He pushed for the door to open wider. He tried to shorten the distance and control the doorway conversation. He kept pressing for Adrian to step outside because he needed the setting to change. Adrian stayed in the same place and stayed controlled. No back and forth. No emotional performance. Just the same requirement, repeated the same way. Julia then requested a supervisor while recording. That changed the situation because it forced the lead agent to bring someone higher ranking into a scene that was already being documented. It also meant the decision to withhold the warrant on camera would no longer be something Harlow could keep informal or ambiguous. Harlow resisted at first, but the longer the team stayed under bright lights at a residence without producing the warrant on camera, the worse it looked. He radioed up for supervision. While they waited, the neighborhood started reacting. Lights and vehicles at that hour don't stay private. A neighbor across the street watched from inside and began recording from their own angle. That mattered because it created a second timeline outside of the Pierce cameras, capturing how the team arrived and how they positioned vehicles. Then Supervisor Dana Kessler arrived. She didn't approach like she was there to bully her way through a doorway. She approached like someone who understood exposure and oversight. She started asking what the objective was and why the warrant hadn't been presented in a recordable way yet. She looked at Adrian at the threshold, then at her team's posture, then back at the house cameras that were clearly active. Adrian still didn't step outside. He still didn't give them yard control. But now the scene had a supervisor, multiple recordings, and a growing paper trail that would exist whether the team wanted it or not. And at that point, Adrian made a choice that was about to change the tone of everything that happened next. He prepared to disclose who he was, carefully, calmly, and on record, because this wasn't going to stay a midnight intimidation attempt. It was about to become a documented incident with consequences. With Supervisor Dana Kessler now on the scene, the interaction stopped being a one-person pressure push and became a situation that had to make sense in writing later. Kessler looked at the cameras, looked at Adrian holding position at the threshold, and focused on what the team was relying on to be there. Adrian didn't announce anything loudly, he didn't try to intimidate anyone. He stayed controlled and made a clean disclosure under recording conditions. He identified himself as a federal judge and presented identification in a way that could be seen by the doorbell camera and the exterior view. He did it carefully, without stepping into the yard or changing the boundary. Julia stayed in documentation mode. She made sure her phone captured the moment as a backup angle and continued stating key details out loud. The supervisor's arrival, the fact that the lead agent had been refusing to present the warrant on camera, and that Adrian had requested address confirmation from the start. Kessler's posture shifted right after the ID was shown. She stopped treating the doorway like a place where commands would solve the problem and started treating it like a scene that could become a legal incident if mishandled. She asked for the warrant to be produced and asked her team to confirm the target address. Agent Travis Harlow didn't like the change. He had been trying to control the sequence. Now the sequence was being controlled by procedure. Under the supervisor's direction, he produced the paperwork in a way that could be recorded. It wasn't a casual wave of a document from 10 feet away. It was presented in a way where the key fields could be captured on video. That's where the night turned. The address on the warrant did not match the Pierce residence. Not close. Not a typo that could be shrugged off. It was a different address tied to a different location. The number and street were wrong for that house. The legal authority the team claimed at the door did not apply to the people standing behind it. You could see the confidence collapse in real time, not through emotion, but through body language and behavior changes. The lead agent stopped pressing for Adrian to step outside. The team's posture moved from forward pressure to quick containment. Kessler redirected the focus away from the door and back toward her own team, checking what happened, how it happened, and what would be captured on camera. Harlow tried to pivot to a quick exit. The team started repositioning like they wanted to leave without creating more record than already existed. No explanation that matched the intensity of the approach. No accountability language. Just movement toward a quiet retreat. Adrian didn't allow that. He kept his voice level and kept the interaction procedural. He requested the names and badge numbers of the personnel involved. He requested the supervisor's name and the unit details. He requested an incident number or case reference tied to the attempted contact. He also requested confirmation on record that the warrant address did not match his residence. Julia reinforced the record. She captured vehicle plates when they turned. She noted unit markings. She repeated the requests out loud so the footage would show what was being asked and what was being avoided. She didn't argue. She documented. This is where agencies often tried to do the minimum. When the operation goes wrong, the instinct is to reduce the footprint, keep details vague, and leave before the homeowner can collect identifiers. Harlow followed that instinct. He gave as little as possible and tried to move the team out. Kessler had a different problem. She couldn't pretend this hadn't happened, not with multiple cameras recording and a neighbor now watching from across the street. She couldn't treat it like a normal wrong door, sorry moment, because the approach itself had been heavy and the warrant had not been presented promptly. She also couldn't ignore who was standing in that doorway. So she did what supervisors do when they're trying to limit damage while still making the moment survivable on paper. She acknowledged the mismatch in a controlled way, kept the interaction short, and directed the team to disengage. Adrian stayed steady and made sure the final minutes weren't empty. He asked again for the case reference and the correct point of contact for follow-up. He made it clear the footage would be preserved and that formal requests would follow. Julie continued to speak in time-stamped facts. She noted when the team began withdrawing, which vehicles moved first, and which personnel avoided providing identifiers. She captured the last clear shots of plates and markings before the vehicles cleared the property. Within minutes, the yard lighting disappeared. The angled vehicles pulled out. The street went quiet again. But the incident didn't end when the engines left. The key part was already locked in. A documented approach, pressure before verification, delayed warrant presentation, and a warrant that didn't match the house they surrounded. And the Pierces were not going to let that turn into a clean, undocumented mistake that disappeared into internal paperwork. As soon as the vehicles cleared the street, the Pierces shifted from surviving the moment to building the record. Julia didn't wait until morning. She exported the doorbell footage and the exterior camera angles immediately and saved them in more than one place. She pulled the timestamps, labeled files by camera angle, and wrote down the exact order of events while it was still fresh. Adrian did the same thing from his side, a clean timeline, minute by minute, focusing on actions the cameras might not fully capture, like when requests were made, what was refused, and when the supervisor took over. They treated it like evidence, because that's what it was. A heavy nighttime approach can get rewritten fast inside agency paperwork. The fastest way to prevent that is to force the agency to match its internal story to clear video. The next move was formal, not emotional. Adrian and Julia started filing through channels that generated tracking numbers. They did not rely on a phone call that could disappear into, "We'll look into it." They filed written requests and complaints that create a paper trail. Records requests for body-worn camera footage, if any existed, dispatch logs, operational briefings tied to the case number, and documentation showing why that team had been sent to that address. They included the dates, the times, and the supervisor name they had captured. They also filed a complaint focused on conduct, not ideology. The core points were simple and hard to defend. The lead agent applied pressure before verification, refused to present the warrant promptly in a recordable way, and treated lawful questions as non-compliance to force a homeowner into a disadvantageous position. They attached still frames showing the vehicle's setup and lighting, and they referenced the exact moment the warrant was finally displayed, and the address mismatch became undeniable. In the days that followed, the neighborhood part became a factor too. The neighbor who recorded from across the street contacted the Pierces privately and provided their footage. It wasn't dramatic, but it strengthened the timeline. It showed the vehicle angles, the lights, the team's posture, and how long the encounter lasted before a supervisor arrived. It also reduced the agency's ability to claim the Pierces' edited context, because there was an independent angle, Julie handled communication the way people do when they've seen institutions try to isolate a story. She didn't blast it online first. She shared it with counsel and kept copies untouched. She documented who received what and when. She treated every transfer like it could be questioned later. Adrian, because of his role, kept his public footprint controlled. He didn't go to social media. He didn't give interviews in the first week. He did what he expected any careful person to do. He let the record assemble itself and let the process force answers. That process forced contact quickly. Within a short window, the agency's response shifted from silence to structured engagement. That's what happens when a complaint can't be dismissed as confusion or exaggeration. The footage showed the approach clearly, and the warrant mismatch was visible. The delay in presenting the warrant wasn't a rumor. It was time-stamped. An internal review opened, not because the agency wanted public embarrassment, but because the documentation made denial expensive. The review focused on 3 things that are hard to explain away. First, the address verification failure. A team had surrounded the wrong house with a warrant that did not authorize contact at that location. Second, the decision-making at the door. The lead agent prioritized control and compliance language before verifying legal authority at the threshold, then delayed presenting the warrant in a recordable way. Third, the escalation posture. The approach looked like a raid setup, even though this was a residential contact with no immediate threat on record. As that review moved forward, another layer kicked in, matching the paperwork to the video. This is where agencies often get caught. Reports tend to smooth rough edges. Time gets rounded, tone gets softened, refusals get reworded as attempts, but video doesn't negotiate. The Pierces had captured the sequence, repeated requests for the warrant, repeated pressure to step outside, and the supervisor's change in tone. Any narrative that ignored those elements would conflict with evidence. Harlow became the central problem inside that process because the decision points were attached to him. He was the one driving the sequence. He was the one framing verification as non-compliance. He was the one trying to pull Adrian into the yard before showing the warrant. Kessler's involvement mattered too, but in a different way. Her arrival was the moment procedure returned. The team only produced the warrant in a recordable way after she took control. That made her look like the person cleaning up a mess, not creating one. The Pierces' strategy stayed consistent. They didn't ask for apologies. They asked for documentation. They requested the incident number. They requested the case references. They requested confirmation of which office authorized the approach. They requested what training and guidance existed for nighttime residential contacts, and whether address confirmation was required before attempting to compel a resident to exit a home. They also requested corrective action information, not because they expected the agency to volunteer discipline details, but because asking forces the agency to respond in a way that can be compared against outcomes later. Weeks passed, and the situation didn't quietly die the way the team likely expected when they drove away. The issue wasn't just that the team hit the wrong house. It was how they behaved before verifying it was the right house, and how much they relied on pressure to skip the part where a warrant is supposed to justify authority at the door. As the review progressed, the story began to circulate in professional circles and local community circles. People who had dealt with similar late-night approaches recognized the pattern immediately. Some people called it a mistake. Others called it what it looked like on camera, procedure treated as optional until someone forced it to be mandatory. And the agency couldn't keep it contained because the Pierces didn't let the record stay informal. They built a trail that required responses, tracking numbers, and documented positions. By the time the agency realized this wasn't going away, the question had already shifted. It was no longer only about an address mismatch. It was about whether an enforcement team could show up at night, flood a home with lights, push a resident to step outside without producing the warrant first, and then retreat quietly when caught at the wrong door, without consequences. That's where the case started moving toward a resolution that would cost real money and force policy changes. because the footage left no room for the usual escape routes. Once the internal review started, the case stopped being a neighborhood story and became a documentation problem for the agency. The Pierce attorneys requested the operational chain behind the deployment, who approved the approach, what address data they used, what verification steps were logged, and what guidance existed for nighttime residential contacts. The agency could deny opinions, but they couldn't erase timestamps, radio traffic, and written logs if those were requested the right way. Freedom of Information Act and records responses started coming back in pieces. Some pages were redacted, some items were not located, but enough details surfaced to show the structure. The team had moved on a target name tied to an address, and the address verification step failed before they ever put vehicles on the street. The next failure was at the door. The lead agent treated verification requests as delay, pushed for compliance first, and only produced the warrant in a recordable way after supervision arrived. That sequence made the case hard to defend because it wasn't about a split-second decision. It was a series of choices over minutes, all of it recorded. Depositions and interviews focused on what the cameras showed. The questions were simple: why the warrant wasn't presented promptly, why the team posture was so heavy for a residential contact, and why the lead agent kept trying to pull the homeowner outside before confirming legal authority at that specific address. Agent Travis Harlow became the center of the accountability because the escalation decisions traced back to him. Supervisors and agency counsel looked for ways to describe it as a misunderstanding, but the video didn't match that framing. The footage showed pressure first and verification later. Supervisor Dana Kessler's role was different. Her arrival was the moment the team stopped pushing and started checking. That didn't erase the earlier conduct, but it made it clear who was driving the problem before she got there. The review findings didn't stay vague. The agency could argue intent, but it couldn't argue behavior. The documented issues were consistent across the footage and the timeline the Pierces wrote immediately after the situation. Those findings created two outcomes at once: discipline and settlement pressure. On the discipline side, the agency moved to contain risk. Harlow faced consequences tied to decision-making and procedure. Details weren't all public, but the direction was clear. His conduct became the example of what not to do because it created liability and made the agency look like it used intimidation to skip verification. On the civil side, the case moved toward resolution because the evidence made trial exposure dangerous. A public courtroom timeline with clear video, verified timestamps, and a warrant address mismatch doesn't just cost money. It forces testimony about policies, training, and how often these wrong door approaches happen. The case ultimately resolved with a reported $10 million settlement, structured in a way that didn't require an admission of wrongdoing, but did require the government side to treat the incident as serious enough to pay and adjust procedures. The policy tightening mattered more than the money. After the settlement, guidance around nighttime residential approaches was updated with clearer requirements that aligned with what the Pierces demanded from the start. Address verification before deployment using more than one source, documented in the case file. Warrant presentation at the earliest safe moment, in a way that can be recorded by body-worn camera when available. Supervisor involvement earlier, when a resident requests verification and the team can't immediately provide it. None of that fixed what happened, but it reduced how easily the same playbook could be used again. For the Pierces, the long-term change was personal and practical. They didn't become public figures. They didn't turn the incident into a constant media cycle. They used the system the way it's supposed to work: preserve evidence, build a record, force responses, and make it expensive for an agency to pretend nothing happened. When authority shows up at your door, the calm person who keeps it procedural often has the most power in the room, because procedure is what the system is supposed to follow. Cameras, timestamps, and written requests don't create drama. They create accountability. Now ask yourself this: If a team arrived at your home late at night and tried to make you step outside before showing legal authority, what would you do? Would you move first just to make it end? Or would you hold the line and build the record? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've had a situation where someone in power tried to skip steps and rush you, share what happened. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and focused on accountability, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.
Hey, stop right there. What's in your hand? Put it down.
My cane. I'm legally blind. I needed to walk.
What's in your back pocket?
Tell me why you stopped me.
Name and date of birth, now.
I'm walking home. I came from jury duty.
Answer the question, name and date of
I
birth.
will cooperate, but I need the lawful reason first.
You're refusing. That's a problem.
The sidewalk outside that small Florida town was still washed in streetlight glow when they approached him. Early morning, thin traffic, the kind of quiet where a single patrol car rolling up feels louder than it should. Harold Briggs, 61 years old, legally blind, Army veteran, was tapping his cane along the concrete and heading home after jury duty. He wasn't running, wasn't hiding, wasn't bothering anyone, and within seconds, Deputy Lacey Monroe treated the one thing helping him walk like it might be a weapon. Her cruiser spotlight pinned him in place. She came in fast, focused on the cane and the outline of something in his back pocket, talking like she'd already decided what he was. Harold tried to explain, calm, direct, consistent, that he was legally blind, and the stick was a mobility aid. Monroe didn't de-escalate. She pivoted into demands: name, date of birth, compliance on her terms. That was the moment the encounter stopped being about checking on something and became a control contest. And whether the stop truly began over a crosswalk signal, or whether that reason was built later to justify what happened, would become a central issue once the video and the paperwork started getting compared side by side. At this moment, we want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Tell us where you're watching from, your country, your state, your city. And if you like stories where power trips get exposed by policy, cameras, and consequences, hit like and subscribe. Now, rewind, because this did not start with Harold doing something dangerous. It started with one deputy choosing suspicion first and patience last. Harold's morning was routine. When you're legally blind, routine is how you stay safe. Same route, same pace, cane out in front, listening for cars, feeling the curb cuts, moving like someone who knows how quickly a simple walk can turn into a problem if people don't pay attention. The night before, he had been doing what the system asked him to do: jury duty, long hours, controlled environment, a lot of waiting. Then he went home, rested, and set out again early, when sidewalks were emptier and the world was quieter. That's when Monroe saw him. Later, the official story would point to an alleged crosswalk violation tied to a traffic control signal on October 31st. But in real time, what Monroe acted on was not a traffic safety concern. She acted like the cane was suspicious, and the item in his back pocket was a threat. This is how a normal situation gets turned into a high-stakes one. An officer's fear becomes a fact on the spot, and the citizen is expected to play along with that fear no matter how unreasonable it is. Monroe approached with officer safety posture, treating Harold like someone who needed to be managed. She demanded personal information immediately. Harold answered what he could and explained his disability. He kept his body still, kept his hands visible, and kept the cane in the same position it had been the entire time, doing its job. Monroe didn't settle down after hearing he was blind. She doubled down. She treated the explanation like a story she didn't trust, and she treated the refusal to hand over personal details on command like defiance. Harold didn't escalate his tone. He escalated his clarity. He pressed for the lawful basis of the stop and made it clear he didn't believe he was required to provide ID without one. He also did the one thing people are told can help when a stop feels wrong. He requested a supervisor. That request flipped the dynamic. Instead of treating it like a normal oversight step, Monroe treated it like a challenge to her authority. Her posture tightened. Her commands became sharper. The encounter stopped moving toward resolution and started moving toward punishment. And as that shift happened, a bystander across the road noticed the spotlight and the way the deputy kept crowding the conversation. Early morning doesn't have distractions. People hear everything. The bystander pulled out a phone and started recording, not getting involved, not yelling, just documenting. 2 recordings were now building at the same time. The body camera capturing Monroe's framing and the bystander video capturing the broader context and tone. Then Sergeant Todd Klein arrived. This is where a lot of agencies either prevent disaster or seal it in. A supervisor can step in, slow the pace, clarify the reason, and end the contact cleanly. Or a supervisor can back the deputy's ego and turn a questionable stop into a locked-in, "you're going to learn today" moment. Klein chose the second path. He didn't reset the encounter around facts. He treated Harold's calm resistance to demands as a respect issue. He reinforced Monroe instead of asking why a legally blind man with a cane was being handled like a threat. And with the supervisor now aligned against him, Harold was no longer dealing with one deputy's assumptions. He was dealing with a chain of command that refused to step back. When Sergeant Todd Klein stepped in, he didn't come with a reset. He came with alignment. He listened to Monroe's summary first, and her summary wasn't neutral. She framed Harold as suspicious and uncooperative. She repeated the same 2 points that she had been stuck on since the cruiser light hit him: the cane in his hand and the object in his back pocket. She treated both like potential threats, even after Harold had already explained he was legally blind and the stick was a mobility aid. Klein's first move wasn't to verify Harold's condition or ask what specific law justified the detention. His first move was to reinforce the idea that Harold needed to comply because they said so. That's how the chessboard got set. Harold stayed calm and kept doing the same thing he'd been doing since the beginning. He asked if he was being detained, what the legal basis was, and whether he was free to leave. He also made it clear he wasn't refusing to cooperate in general. He was refusing to hand over personal identifying information without a lawful reason. Monroe and Klein treated that distinction like a technicality they could steamroll. Monroe kept repeating commands, tightening the circle around Harold. She kept repositioning to control his movement on the sidewalk. She talked in a way that made the interaction sound more dangerous than it was, using language built for reports and radio traffic rather than for solving a real problem in the moment. Harold's body language didn't match their escalation. He didn't square up. He didn't clench fists. He didn't step towards them. He stood there, cane visible, shoulders still, explaining the same facts again. Legally blind, walking cane, coming from jury duty, trying to get home. Klein's next move was to turn the disagreement into refusal to obey. He didn't argue the law. He argued authority. He treated Harold's questions like a challenge to the badge, and that's the line that changes everything. Because once an officer makes it about authority, the goal stops being public safety and becomes submission. Monroe then shifted to the pocket item. She demanded Harold reveal it. Harold tried to explain it wasn't a weapon and that he wasn't reaching for anything. He also made it clear that sudden grabbing and forced movements were dangerous for him because he couldn't visually track what they were doing. That warning didn't slow them down. It made them more impatient. The bystander across the street kept recording. That mattered because you could hear the pattern. Harold asking for the reason, Monroe and Klein refusing to answer cleanly, then repeating commands as if commands could replace a legal basis. This is the exact point where a stop either ends or turns into a manufactured charge, and they went for the charge. Klein told Monroe to move forward with enforcement based on what he said was non-compliance. Monroe stepped in closer and reached towards Harold's arm area, trying to take control of his positioning. Harold reacted the way a blind person often reacts when someone suddenly grabs them without warning. He stiffened, pulled his arm back slightly, and shifted his weight to keep balance while still holding onto his cane. That small defensive movement was the opening they wanted. Monroe immediately labeled it as resistance. Klein backed her, treating the moment like proof that Harold was actively resisting, even though the conflict was still about whether they had lawful grounds to detain him in the first place. This is the trap. They move from a disputed detention to a sudden physical control attempt, then claim the person's natural balance reaction is resistance, then retroactively declare an arrest to justify the force. Harold kept his voice controlled. He told them he was not attacking them, not reaching for anything, and not trying to run. He emphasized again that he was blind and that they needed to stop grabbing him without explaining what was happening. They didn't stop. Monroe and Klein closed in and forced his arms behind him. From Harold's side, it wasn't a fight. It was confusion plus balance plus pain, and the basic fear of being controlled by people he couldn't visually track. From their side, they described it as him resisting their attempts to arrest him. But the argument that later blew up publicly was simple. If the arrest itself was not lawful at the moment they claimed resistance, then resisting arrest became a label they used to cover the escalation, not a legitimate basis for it. They cuffed him. Monroe kept control of the narrative out loud, calling it active resistance and officer safety. Klein supervised it like it was routine. Harold was then guided toward the cruiser. He moved slowly because he couldn't see the door angle, the curb edge, or where their hands were on him. Instead of giving him clear directional guidance, appropriate for a blind person, they treated his slow movement as more defiance. Everything he did got interpreted as a problem. The bystander's phone caught enough to show the tone and the sequence, a cane treated like a threat, a lawful basis question treated like disobedience, and a supervisor who didn't slow anything down. By the time Harold was placed in the back seat, the stop was no longer being sold as concern about a pedestrian crossing. It was being sold as a resisting arrest. The moment Harold Briggs disappeared behind the closed cruiser door, the story split into two tracks. On the street, it looked like a legally blind man with a cane got treated like a threat and taken in for resisting. On paper, it would soon be described like a routine enforcement action that started with a traffic control issue and escalated because the subject refused to comply. And that gap between what people saw and what the report claimed became the real problem. Within days, the Bodycam clips and the bystander recordings started circulating. People weren't just reacting emotionally. They were pausing, replaying, and comparing. They focused on the order of events, the cane being treated as suspicious, the repeated demand for name and date of birth, Harold explaining he was blind, and the moment the supervisor arrived, and the encounter tightened instead of calming down. That's when the "how did this start?" question got louder. Because the arrest report's justification didn't match the public's first impression from the footage. The written version described the stop beginning because Harold allegedly entered a crosswalk against a traffic control signal on October 31st near a small town outside a major Florida city. But the video attention centered on something else: the deputy's fixation on the cane and the pocket item, and the fact that the stop didn't sound like a simple traffic safety reminder. That mismatch mattered for two reasons. First, it went straight to whether there was a lawful basis to detain him in the first place. Second, it raised the ugliest question in policing: whether the report was written to defend an outcome rather than document reality. Harold's side, through advocates and people speaking for him, emphasized basic facts. He was legally blind, the object was a cane, he was coming back from jury duty, and he asked for a supervisor because he didn't believe the deputy had a lawful reason to demand identification. The broader argument was that resisting arrest became the catch-all label once the interaction turned into a control fight. The sheriff's office didn't treat it like just public noise. An administrative investigation opened. That process moved the way these processes usually move: Bodycam review, supervisor review, policy comparison, interviews, and a careful focus on whether the deputies followed standards for detention, escalation, and civil rights. And this is where the pressure shifted from social media outrage to institutional risk. Because when video is public, the agency can't pretend it's just one person's word. The agency has to defend not only the arrest, but the decision-making that led to it. Every command, every radio update, every justification line becomes evidence. In Harold's case, the investigation didn't end with a clean defense of the deputies. It ended with sustained findings. The administrative investigation concluded on November 7th, and the sheriff's office sustained policy violation findings against both Deputy Lacey Monroe and Sergeant Todd Klein. Klein, the supervisor, got the heavier discipline: immediate demotion, a 7-day suspension without pay, and a 2-year block on promotions or favorable personnel actions. He was also ordered to complete remedial civil rights training. Monroe received a 2-day suspension without pay and was also ordered to complete remedial civil rights training. The sheriff also indicated Harold could provide a sworn statement later depending on his availability, which signaled something important. The agency was building a record, but wasn't treating Harold's direct testimony as the urgent centerpiece from day one. That detail didn't sit well with people who felt the harm was obvious on video, and the burden shouldn't have been on the victim to fit in a statement later. As the discipline became public, the response wasn't relief, it was backlash. The core criticism wasn't that discipline happened. It was that it didn't match the seriousness of what people believed they watched. A legally blind veteran being escalated into an arrest after asserting boundaries and asking for a supervisor. The supervisor, instead of protecting the public from a bad stop, allegedly normalized it and helped finish the escalation. That's why the commentary around the incident framed it as a leadership problem, not a single deputy mistake. A culture issue where supervisors reward aggression and treat calm pushback as disrespect. Then came the sharper allegation that the arrest report itself was part of the wrongdoing. People asked why the policy violations didn't include stronger consequences if the written report described a start point that didn't align with the footage being discussed publicly. The phrase violation of oath started getting used in the conversation, along with demands for accountability beyond short suspensions. And now the sheriff's office was trapped between two realities: an internal process that had delivered discipline and a public that believed the discipline proved the agency knew it was wrong, but still chose to keep both personnel employed. When the sheriff's office released the discipline, they expected it to close the file. Instead, it opened the loudest phase of the story. People read the penalties and did the math. Sergeant Todd Klein lost rank immediately, sat out 7 days without pay, and got a 2-year freeze on promotions and favorable personnel actions. Deputy Lacey Monroe got 2 days without pay. Both got ordered into remedial civil rights training. The agency also said Harold Briggs could provide a sworn statement later based on his availability. And the public reaction wasn't, "Good, they handled it." The reaction was, "That's it?" Veterans groups focused on one fact. A legally blind Army veteran ended up handcuffed after explaining his disability and standing firm on basic rights. Disability advocates focused on another. The cane was treated like a threat, and his limitations weren't accommodated in a way that reduced risk. Legal commentators focused on the structure of the encounter. A disagreement over identity demands turned into a physical control attempt, then got labeled as resisting arrest, even though the whole dispute was whether he was lawfully detained or lawfully under arrest at that moment. And then there was the leadership piece, because the supervisor's job in that scene should have been to slow things down, clarify the lawful reason, and end the contact cleanly if the reason wasn't solid. Instead, the supervisor reinforced the escalation. That's why the commentary you referenced framed it as a culture problem. Not just one deputy getting overreactive, but a supervisor normalizing that behavior, backing it, and helping turn it into an arrest. That's what made the punishment too light argument stick. Critics didn't just want harsher penalties. They wanted separation. They argued that when someone's independence tool gets treated like a weapon and the encounter ends in cuffs, retraining and short suspensions don't fix the core issue. They framed it as a message to the public. If this is what it takes to get only a demotion and a few unpaid days, then the standard is broken. The arrest report became the other pressure point. The report's stated starting reasons centered on Harold entering a crosswalk against a traffic control signal on October 31st. But the public-facing clips and discussions centered on something else: the deputy's fixation on the cane and a pocket item, and the repeated demand for identifying information while refusing to clearly state a lawful basis in a way that matched what viewers believed they were watching. That created the suspicion that the report was written to justify the outcome rather than document the true start of the stop. People asked a simple question: if the agency sustained policy violations, why wasn't there equal accountability for the accuracy of the written report? If the narrative in the report didn't match the public record, why wasn't that treated as a separate, serious issue? That's where accusations like violation of oath got thrown around in public discussion. Because to ordinary people, a report that looks inconsistent feels like the system covering itself. The sheriff's office, by disciplining both employees, effectively admitted the conduct didn't meet policy. But by keeping both employed and focusing on remedial training, they also signaled they were treating it as correctable behavior rather than disqualifying behavior. That split decision is exactly what kept the story alive. Meanwhile, Harold didn't come out of it with a viral win. He came out of it with the reality of being treated like a threat while doing something normal, and the reality that the system's response moved slower than the harm did. In the weeks after, he leaned on routine again. That's what people like him do when something knocks them off balance. He stayed close to familiar paths. He coordinated with advocates. When he was able, he prepared to give his sworn statement as the sheriff's office indicated. He also spoke with legal counsel, because in cases like this, the civil rights questions don't stop at discipline. They extend to unlawful detention, disability accommodation, and whether resisting was used as a cover for a stop that shouldn't have escalated in the first place. And something else happened that agencies never love, but communities rely on. Other people started speaking up. Local residents talked about stops that became confrontations because someone asked basic questions. Disabled community members shared how often mobility aids get treated with suspicion. Former law enforcement voices weighed in on what supervisors are supposed to do and how quickly a scene can turn when a deputy and supervisor both interpret calm boundary setting as defiance. That collective response is what forced the deeper change conversation. Because the real long-term consequence wasn't just one demotion and 2 suspensions. It was the public demand for clear policy and enforceable standards around how officers handle mobility aids, how they communicate and guide people who are visually impaired, what counts as a lawful basis for detention, and how resisting gets charged when the underlying detention or arrest is disputed. Even if the agency didn't announce sweeping reforms on day one, the pressure created a new reality. The public was watching the paperwork, not just the video. People were comparing the report to the footage. They were asking why the supervisor didn't reset the encounter. They were asking why the deputy escalated after hearing the words, legally blind. They were asking why the system still treats asking for a supervisor as a provocation. And Harold's case became an example people used in other conversations, other hearings, and other complaints. Not because he wanted fame, but because it showed the pattern in a clean way. A routine walk became a power contest, then got wrapped in official language to make it look normal. The lesson was blunt. Rights don't protect you if asserting them automatically gets treated as hostility. Oversight doesn't work if supervisors treat every citizen question as disrespect. And accountability doesn't feel real if the consequences don't match what the public can plainly see. So here's the question for you watching. If you were Harold calm, standing still, explaining you were legally blind? What would you have done when the demands kept coming without a clear, lawful basis? And if you've ever had a normal moment turn into a control struggle with someone in authority, share what happened in the comments. Because people learn from each other's experiences. If this kind of story matters to you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that staying calm and staying firm can change outcomes. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you can keep getting stories where the truth holds up under video, policy, and accountability.
Sir, stop. Who you are. I need identification.
What's the reason?
Don't worry about the reason. Give me your ID.
I can be verified. I'm federal law enforcement traveling on official
You
paperwork.
don't look like federal.
I'm telling you, verify me.
You don't get to tell me what to do.
Hands behind your back.
2 airport police officers at Chicago O'Hare thought they could stop a black man in the terminal, ignore his federal paperwork, and turn a simple verification into a public takedown with 0 consequences. What they didn't know was that the calm man they decided to flex on wasn't a random traveler they could push around. He was an FBI special agent returning from a federal mission, traveling on official documentation for a scheduled follow-up briefing. And the moment they put hands on him, they created a problem that would not stay inside that terminal. At this moment, we want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now, before we rewind, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your country or state in the comments. And if you watch stories where people stay calm, facts win, and accountability actually happens, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This started at around 9 a.m. inside Chicago O'Hare International Airport when the terminal was already moving fast. Morning flights, families dragging luggage, business travelers walking with purpose, gate agents calling names, and that normal airport noise that makes people tune everything out unless something looks serious. Caleb Rivers stood out for one reason only. He didn't look stressed. He moved like someone on a tight schedule, but fully in control. He had official travel documents and federal credentials because he was coming off a federal mission and heading toward a scheduled follow-up briefing. He wasn't wandering, not looking around suspiciously, not causing any disruption. He was doing exactly what airports are built for, getting from point A to point B. That's when airport police officers Derek Vaughn and Evan Klein stepped into his path. They didn't approach like they needed help identifying someone. They approached like they'd already decided the outcome. Their posture and pace signaled it. Vaughn led, Klein backed him up, and stayed close enough to make it clear this wasn't going to be a normal, quick check. Rivers stayed composed and immediately tried to handle it the clean way. He attempted to show his federal credentials and the official travel documents connected to his briefing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to walk past them. He did the thing professionals do when they know procedure matters. He offered verification. Vaughn did not treat it like verification. Instead of taking a breath and looking at what Rivers presented, Vaughn dismissed it. He treated Rivers' calm questions as if they were disrespect. He framed Rivers' tone as a problem, not the situation. This is one of the oldest power moves in these encounters. If the person stays calm and asks for clarification, you label it attitude so you can justify escalation. Rivers tried to keep it on track. He attempted to explain he was returning from a federal mission and traveling on official paperwork. He attempted to redirect them to the simple solution: verify the credentials, confirm the documentation, and let him continue to his scheduled briefing. Vaughn did the opposite. He turned the interaction into a contest. The more Rivers tried to keep it procedural, the more Vaughn treated that as defiance. Vaughn talked over him. Vaughn positioned himself closer. Klein mirrored the stance, giving Vaughn the confidence of a second body, a second uniform, and the implied threat of force. And while all of that happened, the cameras were already in play. Both officers had body cameras. Rivers knew it. He also knew what body cameras do when people remember they're on. They either keep officers honest, or they document how far someone is willing to go when they think they can control the narrative anyway. Around them, travelers started to notice the change in tone. Airports are full of small moments people ignore. This didn't look small. People slowed down, some glanced and kept moving. Others stopped because they saw a man trying to show paperwork, while two officers acted like paperwork didn't matter. A business traveler near the edge of the scene raised a phone. Another person stepped sideways to get a clear view. That's also how modern accountability works. When someone sees an encounter turning wrong, they start recording, not to be dramatic, but because they've learned how quickly the story changes when only one side writes the report. Rivers stayed composed anyway. He didn't perform. He didn't argue just to argue. He tried to keep the situation anchored in facts, credentials, documents, scheduled briefing, official travel. He tried to make it easy for them to do the right thing. Vaughn treated that calm as a challenge. Instead of calling in a supervisor or running a quick verification, Vaughn escalated to detention. That decision mattered. Verification is procedural. Detention is control. Detention is what you do when you want the person to feel the power, not when you want the truth. Klein didn't slow it down. He supported it. He didn't insist on looking at the documents himself. He didn't step back and say they needed to verify first. He stayed in formation with Vaughn, reinforcing the message that Rivers wasn't going anywhere. In a busy terminal, that shift is instant. People hear the tone change. They see the body language tighten. They see hands move closer to belts. They see the circle forming. And when the subject stays calm, it makes the escalation look even worse. Rivers attempted one more time to present his federal credentials. He attempted to get Vaughn to take them seriously. He attempted to keep it from becoming physical. He attempted to keep it from becoming a scene. But Vaughn had already moved past verification. Vaughn treated Rivers' questions as a reason to punish him. The officers closed distance. They positioned themselves like they were preparing for compliance, not conversation. And this is the part most people don't understand until they see the footage later. Once an officer decides calm is attitude, the situation becomes rigged. Anything you say can be labeled non-compliance. Anything you do can be called resisting. Even standing still can be framed as refusal. Rivers stayed steady. He didn't swing. He didn't shove. He didn't threaten. He didn't do anything that would justify force to the people watching. Vaughn and Klein moved anyway. Travelers were now fully watching. At least one person was recording with a clear angle. The officers' body cameras were capturing the audio, the pacing, and the exact sequence of choices. And Rivers, in that moment, understood something that Vaughn clearly didn't. This wasn't going to end with a simple airport report. Because the second they put him in a detention posture without verifying the federal credentials in front of them, they weren't just making a bad stop. They were creating evidence. And the next move they made was the one that turned a tense interaction into a public incident that would pull supervisors, command staff, internal affairs, and federal eyes into the terminal. The moment Vaughn decided this was a detention, he moved like the paperwork didn't exist. Rivers stayed where he was and kept his hands visible. He didn't try to run, didn't lunge, didn't step into either officer. He kept repeating the same basic point through calm, procedural language. He could be verified right there, and the documents were in front of them. Vaughn treated that calm like a challenge. He told Rivers to turn, and he framed Rivers' attempt to explain his arguing. Klein closed in at the same time, taking the position that turns a stop into a two-person control hold. This is where a lot of these encounters go sideways, and it's not complicated. If the officers had wanted verification, one of them would have stepped back, looked at the credentials, and radioed it in. Instead, they moved to physical control first, like the goal was compliance and embarrassment, not truth. They forced Rivers' hands behind his back. Rivers did not swing or fight. He tensed like any person would when strangers grab their arms in public, but he did not strike anyone, and he did not attempt to flee. That didn't matter. Vaughn and Klein used the moment to justify taking him down onto the terminal floor, right in the middle of the foot traffic. People nearby reacted immediately. Some backed away fast, others froze. A few started speaking up, but most did what modern travelers do when they see something that looks wrong. They recorded. Lila Chen, a business traveler who had already been watching, kept her phone steady and aimed low enough to catch the hands, the takedown, and the cuffs. She didn't narrate for attention. She recorded because she understood what happens when there's no footage. Other phones came up too. Different angles, different distances. In an airport, that means something important. You don't just get one version of events. You get a timeline from multiple viewpoints, and through all of it, the officers' body cameras captured the same thing the public did. Rivers offering credentials, Vaughn refusing to treat them as real, and the decision to escalate before verifying anything. Vaughn and Klein placed Rivers in handcuffs while he was on the floor. They held him there long enough for it to become a scene, not just a stop. Travelers walking past started slowing down, not because they were curious, but because something about it didn't match what they were seeing. Rivers still didn't panic. He kept his voice controlled and stayed focused on the same points. He was a federal agent. He had official travel documents, and this could be resolved with verification. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't begging. He was staying professional even while he was restrained in public. That contrast is what made Vaughn look worse in real time. When someone is calm and the officers are escalating, the crowd reads it fast, and Vaughn didn't help himself. Instead of switching into verification mode once the cuffs were on, he doubled down on control. He acted like the documents were irrelevant and pushed the idea that Rivers' calm pushback was disrespectful. In that moment, the bias didn't need a slur to be visible. It was in the way he refused to accept the simplest proof right in front of him. The commotion pulled a supervising sergeant toward them. Monica Hale arrived with the posture of someone who didn't want a story, just answers. She didn't stroll in slowly. She came in with urgency, because the scene already had phones pointed at it, and because she could tell from the crowd's reaction that something had gone off the rails. Hale's first move was the move Vaughn should have made from the start. She demanded to see Rivers' credentials and his travel documentation. Rivers provided them immediately. Hale reviewed what he had and verified what it said. She didn't treat the paperwork like a prop. She treated it like what it was: official documentation tied to federal work and a scheduled follow-up briefing. Within seconds, Hale confirmed Rivers was legitimate. And once she confirmed it, she didn't play the quiet cover-up game. She challenged the justification for the stop and the level of force used. She focused on the obvious question: why did this become a takedown when verification was available from the beginning? Hale's next move showed she understood the stakes. She called the duty chief, Captain Lawrence Mercer, and requested an immediate response to the scene. That call changed everything, because when command staff arrives, the goal shifts. It stops being about winning the moment and starts being about protecting the department from a documented mistake. And this one wasn't just a documented mistake. It involved a verified FBI special agent in a major international airport, with multiple videos already being created by the public. Captain Mercer arrived and assessed the situation fast. He didn't need a long briefing. He didn't need officers to spin it. He saw the cuffs. He saw the crowd. He saw the phones. He saw Hale holding paperwork that should have ended the stop before it ever got physical. Mercer immediately removed Vaughn and Klein from direct contact. He ordered all camera footage preserved without alteration. He made it clear the Bodycam video, audio, and any relevant surveillance clips were to be locked down. He didn't leave room for misunderstanding, and he didn't give anyone time to get cute with technical issues. Then he opened an internal investigation on the spot. Mercer also notified federal contacts, because this wasn't just a complaint from a traveler. This was an incident involving a confirmed FBI agent on official travel, detained and handcuffed in public after presenting credentials. That's the moment the power chess game flipped. Vaughn and Klein had started this thinking they controlled the outcome because they controlled the stop. But they didn't control the recordings. They didn't control the supervisor who showed up and refused to rubber stamp the story. And they definitely didn't control a duty chief who understood what federal scrutiny looks like. Hale ensured Rivers was brought up from the floor and that the cuffs were removed once his identity and status were verified. The tone around Rivers changed immediately once Mercer took command. People didn't suddenly become kinder. They became careful. And Rivers didn't celebrate. He stayed composed. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't posture for the crowd. He did what a professional does when the truth is finally acknowledged. He let the process start, because now the evidence was secured. By the time the scene settled, everyone involved understood this wasn't going to be handled quietly. There was Bodycam footage capturing the escalation. There were civilian videos capturing the takedown. There were witnesses in the terminal. And there was a supervising sergeant and a duty chief who had already created a paper trail that would force accountability. Vaughn and Klein were done controlling the narrative the second Mercer ordered that footage preserved. Once Captain Mercer locked the scene down, the airport didn't treat it like a routine incident anymore. It moved straight into damage control mode, and not the sloppy kind. This was the kind where leadership knew the footage would speak louder than any report. Within hours, Vaughn and Klein were removed from active duty and placed on leave while the department started formal reviews. Internal Affairs took over the primary investigation on the department side. At the same time, because the detained person was a verified FBI special agent on official travel, federal contacts were notified, and the incident triggered immediate outside scrutiny. That mattered for one reason. It stopped anyone from trying to shrink the story into miscommunication. The evidence trail was already heavy. There was Bodycam footage capturing the approach, the refusal to properly review documents, the escalation language, and the timing of the decision to go hands-on. There were civilian videos capturing the public takedown and the cuffs on a crowded terminal floor. There were witnesses who didn't know Rivers personally and had nothing to gain from stepping forward, which is exactly why their statements carried weight. And the department had another problem: prior history. As Internal Affairs built the case file, they weren't just looking at this one moment. They pulled prior complaints, use of force reports, and any patterns tied to Vaughn and Klein. Even when older complaints hadn't resulted in discipline, they still showed how often an officer ended up at the center of the same kind of incident. That's how termination-level cases become hard to defend. It's not just what happened once. It's what keeps happening. In the days that followed, the incident spread the way these stories always spread now: fast, clipped, and wide. A short civilian video hit social media first. Then other angles surfaced. Then people started comparing timestamps to the department's initial public messaging. That's when pressure rises, because it becomes less about opinions and more about contradictions. Reporters began calling the airport police department for comment. Travelers posted their own accounts about the moment the scene started and how quickly it became physical. A few said they initially assumed the officers had a strong reason, but changed their view when they saw Rivers trying to present documentation while the officers stayed focused on controlling him instead of verifying him. Behind the scenes, the department's legal team pushed one priority above everything else: preserve every piece of footage, preserve every log, preserve every radio call, preserve every report version. Because any gap would look like tampering, and tampering would turn a serious case into a career-ending scandal for leadership too. Captain Mercer did not leave that to chance. He kept the chain of custody tight and treated the Bodycam handling like an evidence locker issue, not a PR issue. Sergeant Hale's actions mattered in the investigation more than people realize. She arrived, demanded credentials, confirmed legitimacy quickly, and challenged the escalation. That created an internal record that the stop could have been resolved through verification. It also removed the most common defense officers use after a bad encounter. The claim that nobody knew and everyone acted reasonably based on confusion. Because Hale proved it wasn't confusing. It was ignored. While Internal Affairs did its work, Rivers did his. He documented everything from his side immediately. Timeline, purpose of travel, the follow-up briefing he was scheduled to attend, and the fact that he had official paperwork and credentials available at the moment of contact. He also identified witnesses who were willing to provide statements and made sure the civilian video record wasn't treated as online noise, but as evidence that matched the body cam footage. Then the civil rights track began. Because this wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about a stop that escalated into force and detention after a calm offer of verification with strong indicators that bias influenced the decision-making. Rivers moved forward with a federal civil rights claim, supported by the footage, witness statements, and the investigative record that followed. As the parallel reviews progressed, Vaughn and Klein didn't just face a slap on the wrist. They faced termination-level discipline. The department had to evaluate policy violations around escalation, use of force justification, conduct, and the refusal to properly verify identification when it was presented. That's where certifications come into play too, because when an officer is found to have used unjustified force or made a stop that crosses civil rights lines, it can trigger consequences beyond one department, including decertification risk, depending on the outcome and the state's standards. This wasn't the kind of case where they could quietly move someone to a different shift and call it retraining. The evidence made that option look like a cover-up. The department also faced institutional consequences because leadership had to answer a bigger question. How did two officers feel comfortable escalating that fast in a busy terminal with cameras everywhere? So the policy side changed. The department was pushed into tighter oversight on bias-related stops, use of force thresholds, and body cam accountability. Supervisors were given clearer intervention requirements, especially in high-visibility public encounters. Verification procedures were tightened so that when official documentation is offered, officers are expected to take specific steps before escalating. Body cam preservation rules were reinforced with stricter penalties for any delay or mishandling. They also had to address the attitude problem without calling it that in public, because everybody watching already understood the pattern. Calm questions were treated like disrespect, and that label became the excuse to escalate. Rivers did not walk away from it like it was just another bad day. He stayed professional, but he didn't let the incident get minimized. He pursued accountability through documented facts, not emotions. That's what gave the case strength. His calm in the moment, his organization afterward, and the amount of independent evidence that matched his account. And the most important ripple effect wasn't even about Rivers. It was about every traveler who watched that video later and recognized the moment where this could have ended peacefully, but didn't, because two officers chose control over verification. It reminded people that documentation matters, recordings matter, and supervisors who step in with backbone matter. Because when oversight actually shows up, power stops being a weapon and becomes a responsibility again. So here's the question for you. If you were in that terminal and you saw a calm person offering credentials while officers escalated anyway, would you record? Would you speak up? Or would you keep walking and hope it wasn't you next? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever experienced something similar, share what happened and what you learned from it. And if you want more stories where facts win, accountability follows, and people don't get to rewrite what happened, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Sir, stop right there. I need to see identification.
Okay, tell me what this is about, and I'll hand you my ID.
Just answer the questions. What's your name, and are you a U.S. citizen?
Yes, I'm a U.S. citizen. I can show you my ID.
Tell me what you're investigating so I can move safely. Where were you born?
United States.
The document answers that. All right, we're done talking. You're coming with...
The entrance lot outside Ridgeview Mobility and Rehab Clinic in Cedar Point, Oregon, looked like any other weekday medical stop until the federal badges showed up. Late morning, patients coming and going, a van unloading a walker, staff moving between the front desk and the curb cut. Samuel Hart, 50 years old and paraplegic, rolled himself into the access lane near the doors with a slim folder on his lap and an appointment on the calendar like he'd done dozens of times before. He never made it inside. Boots moved fast behind him. A small ICE team closed in with their vests visible and their posture set, like they'd already decided what kind of encounter this would be. The lead agent, Caleb Rourke, didn't treat it like a basic contact or a quick check. He steered it straight into a citizenship verification demand and pushed Samuel to comply only in the way he wanted, not in the way that would actually confirm anything. Samuel offered identification. Staff offered to confirm he was a scheduled patient. Medical documentation and citizenship paperwork were held out in plain view. Rourke refused to meaningfully look at any of it, and that was the moment the clinic staff realized this wasn't about verification. It was about control. At this point, I just want to say we really appreciate you spending your time with us today. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. State, city, or country. And if you watch stories about accountability, abuse of authority getting exposed, and people keeping their dignity under pressure, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now, zoom out, because this wasn't some misunderstanding that got cleared up in 30 seconds. This was a medical clinic parking lot turning into a public incident, recorded by phones and clinic cameras. And it ended up pulling in ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility and DHS oversight. People later argued about motives, procedure, and bias. But the core problem was simple. Multiple forms of verification were offered, and the agent leading the contact showed almost no interest in checking them. Samuel Hart wasn't a random passerby. He was medically retired from federal work, the kind of person who knew how agencies operated and kept his paperwork straight because he'd spent years inside systems that demanded it. He came to Ridgeview for mobility and rehab care. Staff knew him. He wasn't new, he wasn't disruptive, and he wasn't there to argue with anyone. He was there to do therapy and go home. The clinic itself ran on routine. Appointments were scheduled tight. Staff moved on timelines. Patients needed predictable environments because many of them were dealing with pain, fatigue, and mobility limitations. That mattered because when the agents arrived, the staff didn't react like people trying to pick a fight. They reacted like professionals trying to prevent a scene from endangering patients. Rourke didn't respond like a professional trying to confirm facts and leave. The approach started with attention that didn't match the setting. Rourke and his team focused on Samuel immediately. They didn't ask the clinic to verify anything first. They didn't start with the simplest question that could be resolved in seconds. They moved straight into a status check, and the way they did it put Samuel in a corner, socially and physically, because a man in a wheelchair in an access lane can't just step away to cool things down. Samuel did what calm, prepared people do. He presented identification. He offered citizenship paperwork. He didn't wave it around or act dramatic. He held it where it could be seen and tried to give them the quickest path to verifying and ending the contact. Clinic staff stepped in beside him and reported the same thing. Samuel was a regular client with a scheduled appointment. They offered to pull his appointment record. They offered to verify his identity through their intake information. They offered medical documentation showing why he was there and why the interaction needed to stay safe and controlled. Rourke treated that help like it didn't count. He brushed off staff attempts to confirm Samuel's presence as irrelevant. He dismissed on-site security when the guard tried to mediate and keep the space safe. He kept steering the interaction back to his own terms, as if the only acceptable outcome was Samuel complying in a way that let Rourke look in charge, not in a way that actually verified the truth. Witnesses later described that as the moment the situation felt racially motivated, not because anyone read minds, but because of how fast it escalated and how little curiosity Rourke showed about the documents in front of him. People saw a man offering proof, saw staff offering confirmation, and saw an agent refusing to engage with any of it while escalating anyway. That's the power game in real life. The authority figure controls the definition of cooperation. If the person complies in a way that solves the issue, but doesn't submit to the performance, the authority figure labels it refusal. Samuel stayed composed. He stayed on the same message. He was a citizen. He had documentation, and he was there for a scheduled medical appointment. He didn't give Rourke a reason to claim fear or danger. He didn't act unstable. He didn't create a threat. Rourke still shifted the tone from inquiry to control. He positioned his team closer. He used body placement to tighten space instead of creating room. He redirected attention away from the paperwork and toward compliance language. The clinic staff could see it in real time. This wasn't being handled like an interaction meant to end quickly. It was being handled like an interaction being built into something bigger. Then, the cameras appeared. First, one bystander's phone came up, then another. People had seen enough public incidents to recognize the pattern. Someone calm offering documents, an authority figure refusing to look, and a situation getting pushed toward force. The clinic's exterior cameras were already running, covering the entrance and access lanes for safety. The moment was now being captured from multiple angles. That should have ended it, or at least slowed it down. It did the opposite. Instead of taking the clean exit, look at the documents, confirm, leave, Rourke doubled down on control. He treated the continued offers of verification as argument. He treated staff involvement as interference. He acted like outside confirmation from a medical clinic, and an on-site guard didn't matter, even though those were exactly the kinds of neutral sources that usually help close an identity question fast. Samuel still didn't change. He kept the paperwork available. He kept his posture controlled. He kept his hands visible and his movements limited. He kept trying to solve the problem using the tools any normal person would use: documents, records, witnesses. And that's when staff saw the shift that turns a tense scene into a disaster. Rourke stopped acting like he was checking status and started acting like he was setting up custody. His attention moved from the paperwork to Samuel's body position in the wheelchair. His team moved in tighter. The words he used, based on witnesses, centered on Samuel not verifying properly, even though Samuel had repeatedly presented what he had. The bystanders kept recording. The clinic cameras kept rolling. The staff stayed close enough to witness, but far enough to avoid giving Rourke an excuse to claim he was being obstructed. Samuel was about to be arrested in a medical clinic parking lot, not because he lacked proof, but because the agent leading the contact refused to treat proof as proof. Rourke made the move that every witness remembered the same way later. He stopped treating Samuel like a person with paperwork and started treating him like a body that needed to be controlled. Samuel was still in the wheelchair, still holding documents that could have ended the entire situation in minutes. Staff were still nearby, still offering to verify through clinic records and to keep the interaction calm. On-site security was still present, watching for patient safety issues and trying to prevent a physical confrontation in an access lane. Rourke didn't slow down. He directed his team to take custody. In that moment, the logic shifted from verification to domination. Instead of accepting the information offered, Rourke framed Samuel's insistence on being verified properly as a refusal to comply. That framing mattered because it gave Rourke the excuse he needed to escalate while acting like Samuel forced his hand. Bystanders didn't miss it. Phones stayed up. People kept recording because the scene didn't match the justification. A man in a wheelchair was offering documents. Staff were offering confirmation. The agent was escalating anyway. Samuel stayed composed. He did what a careful person does when they know everything is being twisted. He kept his movements limited, kept his hands visible, and continued presenting the same proof he'd already offered. He didn't turn it into a shouting match. He didn't create a threat. Rourke moved in close to the wheelchair. Witnesses later described Rourke reaching toward Samuel in the chair in a way that looked rushed and careless for the setting. The chair wasn't just an object. It was Samuel's stability. It was his safety. It was the only reason he could move through the world independently, and Rourke treated it like a handle. Clinic staff reacted immediately because they understood the obvious risk. They reported later that they tried to get Rourke to stop and let them assist to avoid a fall and keep things safe. Security also stepped forward to keep space clear and prevent a pileup around a disabled patient. Rourke waved them off again. That refusal wasn't small. It meant Rourke chose force over procedure and chose ego over safety in a place built for medical care. The arrest turned physical fast. As Rourke grabbed and repositioned the wheelchair, Samuel's balance shifted. Witnesses in video later supported the same outcome. Samuel ended up on the pavement. It happened in seconds, in full view of staff, patients, and cameras. It wasn't a controlled transfer. It wasn't a careful removal. It was a loss of stability caused by someone handling a wheelchair like it didn't have a human being attached to it. Samuel hit the ground and stayed there. People in the parking lot reacted the way people do when something crosses a line. Staff moved toward him, but carefully, because they didn't want to make it worse. Someone called for medical help immediately. The security guard worked to keep space around Samuel open so he could breathe, and so EMS could get in quickly. Rourke did what authority figures often do after a visible mistake. He tried to frame it before anyone else could. Witnesses later said Rourke pushed the narrative that it was an accident and that Samuel's behavior caused it. The problem was that the videos didn't support that version. The footage showed Samuel offering documents and staying controlled. It showed Rourke escalating, closing space, and handling the chair and Samuel in a way that created the fall. And because multiple people were recording, there wasn't just one angle. There were several. Clinic cameras also captured the wide view. Those cameras didn't care about anyone's story. They captured timing, positions, movement, and the order of events. They captured the difference between a careful procedure and a rushed control tactic. EMS arrived and treated Samuel on site before transporting him. Staff stayed involved because Samuel was their patient and because they understood documentation would matter later. They noted the timeline, the witnesses, and what was offered and refused. They also understood something else that became clear fast. The physical injury wasn't the only damage. Samuel had been publicly treated like a suspect in a place where he came for care, and it happened in front of people who knew he was there legitimately. Rourke and the team remained on scene long enough to keep control of the immediate area, but control was already slipping. Not because anyone was fighting them, but because recording had turned the parking lot into evidence. Within hours, clips started moving beyond the clinic. First through private messages, then through local community pages, then through wider social platforms. The story spread the same way these incidents always spread. Someone posts video, people ask what happened, and then more angles appear that either confirm the first clip or expose what was left out. This is where the power chess game flipped. In the moment, Rourke held badges, a team, and the authority to arrest. After the moment, the public had footage, timestamps, and witnesses who could describe what they saw without needing to guess. And the details were hard to defend. A scheduled clinic patient, known to staff, offering citizenship paperwork and ID, with agents refusing to meaningfully review it, escalating anyway, and then a disabled man ending up on the pavement during an arrest that did not need to happen. As the clip circulated, the questions became sharper. Why refuse the documents? Why dismiss staff verification? Why ignore on-site security, trying to keep patients safe? Why take physical control in a way that made a fall predictable? Those questions didn't come from rumors. They came from what people could see. The first official responses tried to keep it contained, leaning on generic language and the idea that the incident was being reviewed. But the public didn't treat it like a mystery because the video didn't leave much room. People could watch the escalation. They could watch the refusal to verify. They could watch the moment Samuel hit the ground. By the end of the first news cycle, this was no longer just a clinic incident. It was a federal optics problem, and it was headed toward oversight, whether anyone wanted it or not. Once the video spread past Cedar Point, the situation stopped being a local incident and became an evidence problem for the agency. ICE leadership couldn't treat it like a private complaint because it wasn't just one person's account. It was multiple recordings, clinic camera footage, timestamps, and staff statements that lined up. The public saw the same sequence. Samuel offered documentation, staff offered confirmation, the lead agent refused to engage with it, and the interaction escalated into a physical arrest that ended with a disabled man injured on the ground outside a medical clinic. Within days, ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility opened a formal review. DHS oversight offices also got involved because this wasn't just about one arrest. It raised bigger questions about how status checks were being initiated, how agents were handling disability-related interactions, and whether the refusal to review documents was deliberate. Rourke was placed on administrative leave while the review started. That move wasn't a punishment. It was containment. Agencies do it when they know footage exists, and they need time to collect statements, logs, camera access, and chain of custody records before anyone makes things worse. The clinic didn't let the evidence disappear. Ridgeview's leadership preserved their exterior camera footage immediately. Staff documented what they saw while it was still fresh. The security guard wrote a detailed incident report. Bystanders backed up their recordings and shared copies. EMS records established injuries and timing without relying on anyone's opinion. By the time investigators started asking questions, there wasn't just one story being told. There was a record. Rourke's initial framing of it as an accident didn't hold up under that record. Investigators didn't need speculation. They had footage showing how quickly the interaction escalated, how often verification was offered, and how often it was dismissed. They had witness statements describing the same pattern: a refusal to verify, a dismissal of staff input, and control tactics used in a setting where medical safety should have been the priority. Public attention made it move faster. Local media requested information. Advocacy groups highlighted the disability aspect and questioned the legality of turning a clinic visit into a status confrontation without a clear basis. Community members called it profiling because the behavior looked like a decision had been made before any documents were considered. Samuel's recovery was not simple. He already lived with a disability. The fall and the arrest created setbacks that affected his mobility care and his trust in public interactions. Staff supported him through the immediate crisis, but the bigger reality was this. He went to therapy that day and left in an ambulance, while his paperwork sat ignored. That's where the legal response started. Samuel retained counsel. His attorney, Marisol Vega, didn't build the case around emotion. She built it around procedure, evidence, and avoidable escalation. She focused on the refusal to verify documentation, the decision to ignore clinic and security verification, the shift from questioning to physical control, and the injury outcome that followed. The claims were federal, and they were serious. They addressed unlawful detention and arrest logic, excessive force issues tied to disability interaction, and failures in de-escalation and evidence handling. They also targeted the decision-making chain, not just the physical moment, because the clearest problem wasn't only that Samuel ended up on the pavement. The clearest problem was that the situation never needed to get anywhere near that point. As the internal process continued, Rourke's position weakened. Administrative leave turned into deeper review. The agency had to answer for why a lead agent refused to review documents being offered, why staff attempts to verify a scheduled patient were treated like interference, and why a wheelchair interaction was handled in a way that created a high risk of injury. Rourke was ultimately terminated. That termination didn't erase what happened, but it signaled that the agency couldn't defend his conduct once the evidence was fully examined. It also sent a message to every agent watching the fallout. Cameras, witnesses, and preserved records could remove the usual room for spin. The civil case didn't end with a symbolic apology. It ended with a multi-million-dollar settlement and documented changes that went beyond one employee. The settlement included policy and training updates focused on status check procedure, disability interactions, de-escalation standards, and evidence preservation requirements. The goal wasn't just to punish. It was to reduce the chances that another person in a vulnerable position would face the same kind of escalation while trying to access medical care. Ridgeview changed its own protocols too. Staff received updated guidance on how to respond when law enforcement or federal agents arrived on site. They tightened documentation procedures, clarified who had authority to coordinate with outside agencies, and reinforced immediate steps for preserving camera footage and incident reports. The clinic didn't want to be the setting for another preventable disaster. Samuel didn't walk away from this with a win feeling. He got accountability, compensation, and policy change, but he also carried the reality of what it cost him physically and emotionally. What he did gain was something important. He didn't have to wonder whether the world saw what happened. The evidence made it impossible to pretend it was nothing. And that's the point viewers should take from this. This wasn't a story about someone being loud. It was about someone being prepared, staying calm, and still being targeted by an authority figure who refused to verify the truth. The accountability didn't come from a miracle. It came from documentation, witnesses, preserved footage, and